William, we talked in the first part there about nothing being new. I was interested to read that in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that I think to probably do away with a lot of the race courses, there was a minimum plate value of £50 increased to £100. Now, looking at the figures in your book that you included, that would roughly translate to about 10,000 and 20,000 pound these days. So the prize money back in those days was the equivalent, a lot more than it is now for your run of the mill meeting.
Yes, it was. The history of minimum values, if you like, goes back a lot further. The government, there were all sorts of acts to try and control gambling. Gambling exploded in the early 18th century, late 17th, sorry, and early 18th century. And by 1740, the government was introduced a number of acts, in fact, for different forms of gambling. With the racing being the last one, introduced in 1739 to come into act in 1740. And it was a minimum of £50 then, and you could be fined £200 if you broke the rule. And the extraordinary thing is just how quickly that was disobeyed. And of course, and it's a great lesson, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit more, that of course people straight away started to find ways around it. They would say the race is worth £50. Oh, but you have to give 10 backs to the clerk, £5 for bells, £5 for drums, £10 for your horse staying there. And so basically it ended up being worthless as before. This was reenacted. It finally died a death, that act, 100 years later, although everyone had completely forgotten about it, and it came to an end in a rather extraordinary way or it came to a practical end in an extraordinary way, because in 1825, there was a race meeting at Rochdale, and a man called Edge sort of found this old act and thought, I can make a quick £100, because one of the things was the two, when in 1740 it was first enacted, there was no police force. So what they would do, you would find £200, £100 would go to the informer, and £100 would go to local charities. That was the act. Now Edge thought, I can make a quick £100 here, £100. And so he summons the people who'd run the race at Rochdale. And sure enough, it was undefended. No one doubted that the race had been run, and he got the owner of the second in as his primary witness. But a very rowdy crowd turned up at the courthouse, and the judge pretty quickly realised that if he wanted to have a courthouse at the end of this, he better find some way of defeating Edge. So the whole case carried on, and Edge looked to be on a good thing. And the judge suddenly had a brainwave and said, Mr. Edge, was the winner a stallion, a gelding, or a mare? And he said, I have no idea, my lord. Non-suited, and the case was dismissed. And the Duke of Portland then, in fact, got rid of the act. Now, take it forward for 1870, and again, a lot of rowdiness. And by this time, the Jockey Club, and we can talk about how the Jockey Club claimed to control racing, if you like, is that the Jockey Club were very afraid there was going to be an act of Parliament to ban racing. And because particularly a lot of meetings around London were extremely rowdy, a lot of letters in the Times to say how, smashing the place up. And so the Jockey Club tried to head it off by reintroducing the £50 rule, which, as you say, then increased to £100 by 1876. And the way they did it, though, was that is when the park meetings came in. So that in the old days, only the great and good would pay to be on the stand. Most other people would watch for free or very little. And so what would then happen, in order to raise this extra money, they emparked, as in to enclose the whole meeting, so that you couldn't watch the races at all without paying a fee. And that's when Sandown Park, Kempton Park came into being, and various Heath meetings retreated to parks, so that Newton Heath became Haydock Park, Newcastle Town Moor became Gosforth Park, and so that increased the prize money greatly. But the big but is that owners' contributions were enormous. So that it's all very well to say that, yes, most rating meetings now would be thoroughly embarrassed by the level of prize money comparatively, but most owners would be screaming from at the level of entry money they'd be asked to put in. So the racecourses did put in more money. And when, after the Great War, a lot of racecourses have been used in the Great War for military depots and were very much damaged. So they need to repair themselves after the war. And so what they did to pay for it, they reduced prize money. And in an echo of today, there's an article in the Sporting Life in 1919 saying that if racecourses don't put in more money, there'll be no owners, no breeders, no jockeys, no nothing. And here we are, 100 and something years later, having just the same argument.
Yeah, and here we are 100 and something years later as well, with people still trying to save us from ourselves. There appears to have been a seesaw of sort of gambling legislation throughout the years. But it mainly appears to be trying to discourage the poor people from losing their money, when in actual fact, the worst culprits were the landed gentry losing their estates.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Hastings being the prime example. It was a bit of both, really. The first act was actually in 1715 called the Qui Tam Act, and the Qui Tam was a class of act because it literally means whosoever, Qui Tam. And that was, sorry, in 1712 it was. That actually made bets recoverable in law, which persisted for 100 years. And the idea was that you could, any bet over £10 you could recover in law. And if you were claiming it, you could double the amount you were owed. So that, say, if someone bet £30, say, you could claim double the 20 and get 40. That was hoped to discourage people from gambling. In fact, it did anything but. The fielders, the bookmakers thought, great, I can get the money back, and the bettors were only too keen to take them on. And so, in fact, that is why the 1740 Act came in, which, as say, was completely disobeyed straight away. In fact, in the 1830s, I think it was, the courts were so clogged with betting cases, in London particularly, that bets were made unrecoverable in the law. And it is one of the most extraordinary things that in 2005, why the hell the government made bets recoverable in law again. Absolutely extraordinary. If they wanted to solve, not solve, but at least reduce the number of gambling cases and debts and everything else, they'd make bets unrecoverable in law again, because bookmakers aren't going to give bets to people if they can't recover the money. And most of those court cases, quite a few of them, they can't recover the money anyway. But it is the most extraordinary thing to have done in 2005. Great mistake. And so, and then of course, all betting in public places was made illegal. And there were quite a few cases where racecourses, was a dispute as to whether a racecourse was an enclosed place which was allowed to take betting. And there were the Anti-Gambling League. There was a thing called the Anti-Gambling League, supported by various bishops in the 1880s. And one of the big cases was Ali Pali. And the bookmakers used to bet actually on the bank outside Ali Pali. And it went all the way to the High Court. And the High Court decided that was close enough to Ali Pali. I think a few of the justices may have been keen on a punt or two. And the Anti-Gambling League were defeated. But they'd previously won a case at Kingsbury, and then lost in the appeal court. So there was a constant war, as you say, of people trying to stop people gambling. And the lesson from all of this is they never worked. It never worked. There's been about 10 different attempts, I suppose, to foil gambling, to stop gambling, and they've never worked. It is ingrained in the human soul, and it has the most extraordinary unintended consequences. And yeah.
Now, racecourses, but go back to racecourses. Now, stuff I've read, I've been quite interested in this, not just your book, but other things as well. They were fun places to be, but also quite dangerous places. Just a quick skim through your books today. Stands collapsing, loose horses killing spectators, etc. So health and safety didn't exist, did it, at these places?
No, not a concept that they understood at all, really. And the extraordinary, you see, what would happen is on the racecourse itself, the racecourse would sell pitches to the local pubs. And so they would then be responsible for building their establishment to sell beer. And in order to sell the beer and the spirits and everything else, they would give people a viewing platform, because it was obviously the best way to get people in, because otherwise, unless you're going to pay the sort of and be one of the great and good in the official steward stand, which were pretty small generally, if they existed at all, you'd end up on a stand belonging to a pub, and they collapsed like nothing else, because they were very, very jerry built. But even some of the official stands were hopeless. In volume 4, providing we all live that long, is in Paisley. the stand collapsed mightily in 1907, and injured many people. So a lot of these things were very jerry built, and in the it covers Northampton, and one of the pictures beyond the paddock is of this temporary stand, and it looks very dodgy. And you may have seen the one in Volume 1 in Aylesbury, if anyone has Volume 1. You know, there were great big sort of wooden poles holding up the stand. You know, they were very dodgy, and people, you know, the paddock people would wander in and out, and a lot of the race courses only had poles; they didn't have rails for much of the time. And Northampton, funny enough, was one of the courses closed, the first courses to be closed for safety in 1904. And part of that reason, it was right in the city centre. So, and the park is still there, called the racecourse. But it only had poles just after the finishing post, and people were being run over. And they'd try and keep the course clear, but it was hopeless. And you've got to remember, quite a few people on horses themselves, and they'd be following the race. At Newmarket, even they used to follow it right till I think the 1950s. They used to gallop alongside. You could gallop alongside. And so, I mean, they were bedlam. A lot of these courses, they were absolute bedlam.
Now, even more dangerous was actually leaving.
Could be. Certain courses, Hounslow and Barnet, were infamous, and Maidenhead. The Maidenhead races were held on Maidenhead Thicket, and there's still a little bit of the thicket remaining. It's to the west of Maidenhead, but where the course is partly farmland, partly built on, with a railway across it as well. But that was all Maidenhead Thicket, and on the way back, people were frequently being robbed. And on the course themselves, there was pickpockets galore, and they were, again, you know how now a lot of sort of beggars and everything else, they're a fact of commercial teams of beggars and things like that. Well, they had commercial sort of teams of pickpockets, and there was a great case. There was a man called Sir John Astley, who was known as the Mate, who was an enormous person. He was MP for Brigg for a short time, but rarely attended. And when he was asked what he thought of Sir Wilfrid Lawson's liquor bill, he said, "I don't know about Sir Wilfrid's, but mine's a due sight too high," he said. But anyway, he was this enormous man, and he was very popular amongst all classes on the racecourse. And he got his watch pinched. And when he wrote about this, he always wrote about himself and talked about himself in the third person. And he knew who the chief pickpocket was. So he went to him and said, "See here, they've pinched Sir John's watch. This is too bad." And so, "Don't worry, Sir John." And off he went and got the watch back and gave it to him and said, "Sorry, Sir John, the man is new to the profession." And what were they also, what these teams would do would not pinch the watch. They would pinch the watch and then offer to sell it back to the person who had it pinched. And one of the Weatherbys had a watch that he was quite fond of, got it pinched, went to the chief pickpocket, got it back for a certain consideration. It got pinched again, and he went again and got it back. And it went to a third time, and the guy said, and the pickpocket said, "Would you like to buy it back?" And he said, "No, third time, that's it. I'm not that fond of it," and gave up the watch. So, it was, and there could be riots. They would assault the stand at I think it was the Monmouth races, yes, which was run by a man who was actually a dwarf called Duke. Sorry, what the hell was his name? I can't remember what his name was now. He was a little dwarf, and they assaulted the Duke of Beaufort's stand. The Duke of Beaufort owned quite a bit of Monmouth at the time. And he was called Dyke. That's right, he was called Dyke. And he cried out in his little voice, said, "For God's sake, save the Duke." In fact, the Duke was having a fantastic time. He hadn't used his fists for years, and he was having a great time. And he and his colleagues saw off the great unwashed in good style. So it again affected all classes, and all classes enjoyed it. One of the great jockeys of the Victorian times, a fellow called Charlie Cunningham, reckoned he hadn't had a good day unless he'd ended it with a good bit of booze and a punch up. So yeah, they were colourful places.